Hey y'all, Leela with Miss Kiss Kreations. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to show you how I created these sunflower sunshine mommy and me tumblers. I've made these for about 5 years now, and I've always had so many people message me on how I created these. These look very complex, but the design is super simple. So I'm gonna make sure to start at the very beginning and try to go step by step with y'all just to make it a little easier. And like always, all of the materials that I'm using in this video will be linked in my description below, including some links and coupon codes for y'all to check out. And don't forget, you can find me on all of my socials to include Facebook, TikTok, and Instagram. Don't forget to like and follow those accounts because I also have a lot of shorts and a lot of tips and tricks for tumblers and crafts. And with all that being said, let's go ahead and get started with this tutorial. So for these mommy and me tumblers, I typically use a 20-ounce skinny and then an 8-ounce sippy from Maker Flow Crafts. So what I'm going to do first is sand these tumblers. I use anywhere between a 60 to 180 grit sanding block whenever I sand my tumblers, and you want to make sure that you're sanding all around the tumblers, including the rim and the bottom. And then once I was finished sanding, I went in with 91% alcohol, and then I wiped my tumblers down with 91% alcohol. I've always done these designs using my 20-ounce and then my 8-ounce sippy, but if you want to make it on like a toddler's tumbler or even like a 30-ounce, you can use any size. I've just always liked how these two look together. They've always looked so like modern and neat, but any size that you have on hand, you can always do this design on. Once I was finished with prepping these tumblers, I'm going to spray paint these tumblers. This is optional to spray paint the way that I'm going to spray paint, and you'll see what I'm talking about. So before I spray paint, I always put my painter's tape on the inside of my tumblers if I think there's going to be overspray. I know there's different techniques to avoid getting spray paint inside of your tumbler, so if you have some type of device or something you purchased, just go ahead and put that inside your tumbler. But again, we are going to take these tumblers outside and spray paint both of the tumblers. I spray paint these tumblers using white and gold. The reason why I like using white and gold is so when I place my glitter on my tumblers, I kind of have a rough guide of where those glitters are going to be placed. So I'm using my Rust-Oleum metallic gold and then a white flat. It does not have to be a flat finish, but keep in mind that if you are using white glitter, make sure that white area that you spray paint is going to be nice and smooth, because a lot of times white glitter is transparent and you don't want to have any like drips in the background of your glitter or anything peeking through your tumbler. But again, if you don't have any gold on hand, you can always just spray paint your tumbler white, and then you can just skip the gold part. But with the gold, it really gives me a nice like cheat sheet kind of whenever I add my glitter ombre. All right, so let's do the 8-ounce sippy cup first. I always start with the top color. So my top color is going to be white, and I'm just spraying that on top of the tumbler. And then whenever I spray my bottom color, I always do the bottom first. And then when I spray the bottom, I try to aim at the bottom rim of the tumbler. So that way, when the spray paint goes on the tumbler, it's spraying just the bottom. So if you focus and you try to aim that spray paint towards the bottom, then it's going to spray out, and it's going to spray like kind of midsection as well. And then it's really just easy as that. And then I go back in with my top color, which is the white. I do live in an apartment, so I have this little thing set up right here, and I typically spray paint at night. So this is, I wanted to show y'all, so I wanted to kind of just show y'all how I do the spray paint, because a lot of people have questions. So again, going in with my top color, which is the white. So the reason why I do the top first is I do the top, I do the bottom, and then usually the bottom will have overspray on the top. So that's why I do the top, bottom, and then cover up that overspray again with the top. So doing the top and then going right in with that gold. Now this is the 20-ounce, so it's a little longer, so I have more of a space to play with. Doing the bottom first, and then as I'm spraying the tumbler, I'm focusing more on the bottom of the tumbler, knowing that when that spray paint comes out, it's going to go towards the middle of the tumbler. And I didn't do these half and half. I did kind of 3/4 of the gold, and then the rest was, I'm sorry, 1/4 of the gold, and then 3/4 was the white. And then you just let this dry for about 20-25 minutes before moving on to the next step. Make sure these are completely dried before adding your glitter, because you don't want to have any like fingerprints or any wet spray paint whenever you're adding your glitter to your tumbler. And now going back inside, both of my tumblers are completely dried. So I'm going to remove that blue painter's tape because I don't want that to be epoxied stuck to the tumbler. And then I'm going to add these glitters from Glitter Heart Co. And I will have these linked inside of my description, and I'll also have them posted on the screen for y'all. And then I'm going to add the white on the top. So what I did was I added both of those two gold glitters together because the design is kind of like a yellow sunflower. So I wanted gold, but I still wanted some yellow in there as well to kind of bring the design together. So I typically just mix the chunky and then the fine glitter together, and then I add that diamonds on top. The way I'm going to add my glitters is using the epoxy method. Whenever I add chunky glitters to a tumbler, I always think the epoxy method is the easiest for me. But if you want to use any other method that you have that may be easier, go ahead and use that method. So for the epoxy method, you want enough epoxy just for the glitter to act, or just for the epoxy to act as adhesive for the glitter. So think of it as spraying a tumbler with spray adhesive. That thin layer of the spray adhesive is enough for that glitter to stick. So keep that in mind. You don't want to have a bunch of epoxy, and so whenever you add that glitter, that epoxy is going to just absorb all that glitter and it's not going to be even. So try to be patient with just adding a little bit at a time, and then having just a very thin layer for enough of that glitter just to stick to. And then adding the glitter is very easy whenever you have that spray paint underneath. So as you see, I always place my glitters in like a Dixie cup, and this helps me not pour like the entire glitter bottle on my tumbler. And of course these are mixed anyway, so I guess I needed to add it in a Dixie cup. So all I'm doing is placing that glitter on the bottom of the tumbler, and as I'm going towards the middle of the tumbler, I'm lifting that Dixie cup up, and I'm lifting it further away from the tumbler, so I have more of that like ombre effect. So it's not more of like a split two-tone color tumbler, it's more of like that gold is kind of fading to the white. And honestly, like with the white, you'll see that I like overlap that white with the gold a little bit, because you can see that spray paint through that gold. So it does give it a nice like ombre effect with that spray paint underneath, which is another reason why I like that spray paint. And it just turns out like that. So it's very easy whenever you have that cheat sheet on the tumbler with the spray paint when adding the glitter. And then I usually take some glitter and pinch it like salt and kind of just place it around some areas that might have been bare. And then repeating the same steps with my 20-ounce skinny tumbler, again adding a very thin coat of epoxy on the tumbler, and then adding the glitter, adding the bottom color first, which is the gold. And once you add the glitter to the tumbler, you are adding that glitter close to the bottom of the tumbler, and then as you're moving up on the tumbler, you're going to take that glitter and move further away from the tumbler. And once all of your glitter is added to the tumbler, I'm going to show y'all how I press down those chunky glitters on the tumblers, because a lot of times those chunky glitters are very stubborn when you epoxy, and then your tumbler gets very bumpy. But once you've pressed down your glitters, you're then going to let your tumbler spin on the cup turner for about 4 hours. You're then going to turn off your cup turner and then let your tumblers air dry or air cure for another 4 hours. So you really only want an 8-hour drying time. If you do longer, that's fine, but at least 8 hours, since you are adding just a thin coat of epoxy to these tumblers. Now that the glitters are on my tumblers, I'm going to go right in with some parchment paper right after I place those glitters on that tumbler. And I'm going to wrap that parchment paper around my tumblers and just kind of blot or push down. You don't want to smear or rub that parchment paper, but you just want to blot enough, and you're going to see a huge difference when your chunky glitters stick down to the tumblers whenever you do this. The reason why we do this is so you don't have to worry about a bulky or chunky, I guess chunky tumbler around the chunky glitters areas. You want to have a very smooth tumbler. That's probably my biggest pet peeve when working with chunky glitters, is I really want a smooth tumbler and I don't want it to be bumpy in the areas of those stubborn glitter pieces. So once I'm done doing this, I'm then going to let these tumblers cure, and then we will move on with the next step. So now it's been 8 hours and my epoxy's cured. Before I go in with that layer of epoxy over those glitters, I'm going to take my tumblers outside and spray my tumblers with my Krylon Crystal Clear acrylic coating. I sprayed 2 generous coats of this, and this is just to lock all those glitters in place, so whenever you epoxy your tumblers, you don't have to worry about that gold glitter mixing with the white glitter and then it kind of looks like a big just gold and white mess. You want to keep that ombre effect, and you want to keep those 2 colors separated as much as possible. So 2 coats of this, I spray 1 coat, let the tumbler sit for 10 minutes, and then I spray the next coat and then let the tumbler sit for about 20 to 25 minutes before moving on to epoxying my tumblers. And now let's move on to epoxying our tumblers. For my 20-ounce skinny tumbler, I'm going to add a total of 40 mLs of epoxy. That's 20 mLs part A and 20 mLs part B, totaling 40 mLs of epoxy. And for my 8-ounce sippy, I'm going to add 20 mLs of epoxy. That's 10 mLs part A and 10 mLs part B, totaling 20 mLs of epoxy. Now this is only the first coat of epoxy for this tumbler. You're going to allow these epoxy coats to spin and then cure, and then we're actually going to apply another coat of epoxy after this coat. The reason why I'm doing this is because those chunky glitters, and I want to make sure I have a nice smooth surface before adding my decals to the tumbler. So again, add these coats of epoxy, let your tumbler spin on the cup turner for 4 hours, turn off your cup turners, and then let your tumblers air dry or air cure for another 20 hours. I like to have a full 24-hour curing time before moving on to the next coat of epoxy. Okay, so now that the first coat of epoxy is cured, I'm going in with my second coat of epoxy. For my 20-ounce tumbler, I am using about 20 mLs of epoxy. And for my 8-ounce sippy, I'm using about 10 mLs of epoxy total. So I just want enough epoxy to have another coat of epoxy over the first coat. So you don't want like a thicker coat of epoxy for this. And another reason why I like to add a second coat of epoxy is so whenever you sand your tumblers, you don't have to worry about sanding away the glitters. So I went right in with this coat of epoxy. I did not sand between the last coat and this coat of epoxy. Don't worry about bumps or anything. We're going to fix that after this coat of epoxy. So do your first coat of epoxy, let it cure, and then go right back with your second coat of epoxy. And once this is nice and cured, I'll see y'all for the next step. So while that epoxy is curing, let's go ahead and take care of the decals. So the decals are going to be printed on waterslide paper, and that's how I add all of my decals to these tumblers. The waterslide paper that I'm using will be linked in my description below. It is on Amazon, and I've used this waterslide paper for the last 4 to 5 years. And once I found it, it really worked for me, and I use a regular printer, and I just never went back from these waterslide papers. As far as the images, I created these images on my own on Cricut Design Space. I do have them available on my Etsy shop. Remember that these images are going to be a PNG and not an SVG. So you're going to print these out on your printer. If you do have Cricut Design Space, you can print them from Cricut Design Space and then just have your Cricut not cut them. And then I always freehand or cut them myself. So I like to cut around them. As a PNG, if you do choose to print then cut, it's just going to cut around the box and it's not going to cut around like the flowers. So you're going to have to cut them out yourself, and you'll see how I do that in the next steps. I hope that wasn't too much. I hope I made sense, but if not, just keep watching the video and you'll see how I cut these images out. All right, so for my water slides, you have to have these sealed since I am using a regular printer. So I've printed out my designs on my water slide paper, and now I'm going to seal my water slides. I use 2 different sprays to seal these water slides. So I spray 2 times with my Rust-Oleum, and then I spray 2 times with my Plasti-Dip. The reason why I spray with my Rust-Oleum is to make sure that design is locked into place and to make sure that ink does not run whenever you add the water to your water slide paper. The reason why I spray with Plasti-Dip is to make sure that Plasti-Dip lets that paper turn into basically plastic. So that way when you add your water to your water slide paper, you're not going to have your water slide paper rip. That Plasti-Dip allows that paper to be very flexible. So again, 2 coats of Rust-Oleum, 2 coats of Plasti-Dip, and your water slides are nice and sealed, and they are ready to be applied to the tumbler once those coats have completely dried. So now what I typically do is while those coats of Plasti-Dip and Rust-Oleum is drying and I'm spraying in between coats, I'm going back to my tumblers. I'm going to remove those off the cup turner, and then I'm going to clean up the rims of my tumbler. So I do this every time I epoxy. I try to remove any of that excess epoxy, glitter, or paint from the rims, just so at the very end I don't have to mess with it too much. So I just take an X-Acto knife and I cut around the rim of each tumbler, and then once I'm finished cutting around the rim, I'm getting rid of any of that excess epoxy. I'm now going to go in with sanding my tumbler, and since I have 2 coats of epoxy over this glitter, I'm not going to worry about sanding away my glitter on these tumblers. I always like to start with a more fine grit sanding block. So I'm starting with a 220 grit sanding block and I'm sanding around my tumbler. I'm focusing more on the white area because it's a more fine glitter, so it's easier to sand. If I do need to get more stubborn areas sanded, I'm going to move to my 180 grit sanding block and I'm going to sand around the areas where I need those chunky glitters to really be sanded and it's just being stubborn. I'm also going to take that 180 grit sanding block and I'm going to sand around the rim of my tumbler. I want to expose the tiniest bit of stainless steel, so when I add that final coat of epoxy, I'm able to seal in that entire tumbler and I'm able to create the smallest seal so I don't have to worry about the epoxy coming up or peeling up from the rim of my tumblers. And once I'm finished sanding my tumblers, I'm going to take my 91% alcohol and I'm going to wipe around the entire tumbler with my 91% alcohol to remove any of the oils I may have placed on the tumbler from my hands or any of that excess sanding dust that may have been placed on the tumblers. Now let's add our water slide paper. I am using room temperature or warm water. And what I do is I dip my finger inside of my water and then I kind of like place that water on the little black areas on the outside where the design isn't, and to make sure that that's nice and sealed. So if that is sealed and the ink isn't coming off, then I know that my images are sealed. And I typically print out more than what I need just in case I mess up. And now I'm just freehanding, I don't know what it's called, but I'm just cutting out these images on my own. And I try to cut as close as I can to the sunflower. And then I just cut around the images as closely as I can to make sure that it's just easier whenever I place the images on the tumbler. So it's easy as that. Once I've cut out my decals or my images, I place my craft towel down, I place my tumbler on the craft towel, and then I place my image inside of my room temperature or warm water. So now it's just a waiting game. It probably takes about 30 to 45 seconds for the backing to be removed from my water slide paper. And once it is removed, with that Plasti Dip, there's no ripping. And you can see that it just moved right off of the backing, and I'm able to move around that image. It doesn't have to, it's not ripping, there's no wrinkles in that. It's very easy with that Plasti Dip. Then I take like a squeegee or one of those makeup brushes, and I'm just removing any of those air pockets underneath the water slide. And then I'm taking a clean paper towel and I'm just cleaning up the area around that water slide paper, and you can see it looks nice and clean. And once I'm satisfied with that one, I'm going to repeat that same exact step with the sippy cup. Before I add that decal to my sippy cup, I'm going to place the lid on my sippy cup, and I want to make sure I'm lining the decal up with the lid. I never know which side is the front side of a sippy cup, so you can see that I'm like contemplating on like which side to put it on, and I think I even flip it over on like in like 5 seconds. So y'all tell me which side's the right side of the front side of a sippy cup, I should say, because I have no idea. So I'm adding some water to my surface. I'm placing my water slide on my tumbler, and I always like to have a little bit of an area or a gap between my image and the lip or the very front of my tumbler, like the top of my tumbler, because I don't want that water slide hanging over the rim of the tumbler, and it's going to allow that water slide paper to eventually peel up and then ruin the entire tumbler. So having the slightest bit of white exposed or the decal pulled down from the top of the tumbler is what I recommend, so you could have a nice seal whenever you are sealing your tumbler, so you don't have to worry about this design peeling in the next like 6 months to a year. Once these water slides are placed on your tumbler, let this dry for about an hour. Make sure they're completely dried, and then you just go right into epoxying your tumblers. There's no sealing after this. You let these dry, and then you place 2 coats of epoxy on both of your tumblers. And now going in with my 2 final coats of epoxy. So for the 20-ounce skinny tumbler, I added about 15 mLs of epoxy for the first coat, and then 15 mLs of epoxy for the second coat. For my 8-ounce sippy tumbler, I added about 10 mLs of epoxy for the first coat, and then 8 to 10 mLs of epoxy for the second coat. So the idea behind this is to make sure you're adding 2 thin coats of epoxy for those final layers, instead of adding 1 thick coat of epoxy for the final layer, if that makes sense. So I'd rather add 2 thinner coats of epoxy, so I have more room to like sand if I need, and to make sure my tumbler is nice and smooth with no bubbling on the top or the bottom. And then once these are completely cured, we'll move on to the next step with cleaning up the tumblers and showing you the final results. So here I am going in with my X-Acto knife and just cleaning up the rim of the tumbler. Once I'm done cleaning up the rim of the tumbler, I always wash my tumblers out with Dawn dish soap to make sure that the inside is nice and clean as well. And then I add the lids to my tumblers. And here are the final tumblers under the light. Look how gorgeous they are. And you see how I combine that gold and like yellow gold glitter together. I honestly think it looks a lot better than just adding chunky glitter. I think it goes well with the sunflowers and the center of the sunflowers, and then with that black ink with the little sunshine and You're My Sunshine. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you guys did, please be sure to like this video, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more Tumbler and craft videos. And don't forget, you can always find me on TikTok, Instagram, and Facebook. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.